I think it says a lot about how sincerely a group of people, of Jesus people, can take to heart Jesus's words about loving others the way you want to be loved yourself. So I know it means a lot to all of us to see our faces, especially so last minute. This event was not in the books very long ago, just a matter of days and hours. So our hope is that today we will learn something together, that we'll turn up the lights a little bit on our LGBTQ plus siblings, with a special emphasis today on the trans community. And that, like I said, like we'll learn. I know I personally have a lot to learn. And so hopefully with you, we'll have a sense of learning and then figuring out where to go next to learn more. So I know we're all going to have questions and maybe some comments, but I know we'll have questions. So I'm going to ask that you put them in the chat, and I'm going to dole those out to our panel when we're done. And the shorter you can keep those questions, by the way, the fewer words that you use, the easier time I'll have getting through it and passing that on to our panelists. So our panelists today, well, first, me, your winsome host. I'm Steve Doherty. I'm the teaching pastor here at Crosspointe Church, and my pronouns are he, his. We have Artie Hartzell, a social worker and an advocacy and elections strategist for Equality NC, and Artie uses they, them pronouns. We have Artie, I don't know if you're waving just or how many, there, thank you, Artie. And then Krista Naber, psychologist and executive director of the Carolina Sexual Wellness Center in Cary. And Krista uses she, her pronouns. There she is waving, thank you. And Ezra Fairley Collins, United Religion Initiative's coordinator of individual membership. And Ezra's pronouns are he, his. All right, so welcome to the panel. See, if we were live, there'd be applause right there, and that would, you know, I'll never get used to this, the Zoom silences, but alas, here we are. We're going to start with Artie. They have graciously agreed to join us very last minute to help us understand these recent bills that have been proposed right here in North Carolina, as well as their implications. Artie, as I understand it, there are 33 states that have introduced 117 bills that are designed to limit transgender rights, transgender youth rights, which as I understand, is a record-breaking year in the US. So, yay. Can you walk us through North Carolina's contribution to this wave of bills?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I also, for context, organize with Faith in Public Life around non-discrimination, protections for LGBT people, and I'm a student at Chicago Theological Seminary. So it's a pleasure to be with you in faith space. That's really important to me. Yes, there is a coordinated effort nationwide to push these anti-trans bills. It's red meat for the most conservative base and an election matter. But of course, it has tremendous negative impact on trans people, particularly trans youth, trans women, and especially trans people of color. We are definitely dealing with this in North Carolina. And I'll go quickly through some top items about the 3 bills that we're facing. So on March 22nd, they filed House Bill 358, and this is what they called the Save Women's Sports Act. It directly attacks trans youth in schools who seek to participate in sports. It requires students on middle, high school, and intercollegiate sports teams to participate in sports aligned with their sex assigned at birth, the one on their birth certificate. It's invasive, inappropriate, denies them their rights to privacy, and it impacts all trans and gender nonconforming athletes, but the rhetoric is about trans girls. They don't even think about trans boys having to be on girls' teams, which is what we've seen with a wrestler who had to wrestle girls. There are many reasons that we are opposing this bill. One is that all young people have the right to access the benefits of sports participation, like leadership, confidence, self-respect. These are the things that I learned in youth sports, less than the huge competitiveness, especially in childhood sports. Most sports are not elite athletics. They're, community sports, school sports. So trans youth belong in sports, and they belong in the ones that align with their gender identity, because they're already facing disproportionate barriers to success. And this could create even more potentially lifelong physical, mental, and social impacts. There's already regulations in place for North Carolina students. The North Carolina High School Athletics Association has policies in place. When the sponsor of this bill was asked, is this in North Carolina, are there trans athletes? He said he did not know, and that this was mostly a proactive bill. We have asked the North Carolina High School Association how many students in North Carolina are trans and playing sports, and they said fewer than 10. So this is going after a very small number of people, children in the state. We all have varying abilities, and we all need teamwork and team membership to thrive. And that's our biggest takeaway from that. Next, I'm gonna try to get through these. 514 is I hate the name of this, the Youth Health Protection Act. This was filed in the Senate on April 5th, I believe. And the title comes almost directly from the Mental Health Protection Act that we actually had filed against conversion therapy. 514 is an extreme bill that would prohibit trans people under the age of 21 from receiving any medical care around gender, any puberty blockers, any hormones, any therapy, anything. And it requires any state employees, including public school teachers, counselors, and administrators, to share with student parents if they learn that a student has, quote, exhibited symptoms of gender dysphoria, gender nonconformity, whatever that means, and or otherwise demonstrate a desire to be treated in a manner incongruent with a minor's sex. So it's very dangerous. It pushes conversion therapy, and it protects conversion therapy. So this obviously would have far-reaching medical, mental health, social impacts on trans people, not just trans youth. We're talking about adults as well here. And lastly, Senate Bill 515. This one is called the Healthcare Heroes Conscience Protection Act, which you think it's going to be something about the pandemic and protecting health workers who are heroes in our pandemic. No, it is an extreme bill that would allow any medical provider defined so broadly to reach all healthcare entities, as well as individual staff of hospitals, nursing homes, clinics, or pharmacies, to refuse to do anything they object to on the behalf of conscience. So not just religion, they can also name values, including even providing information or referrals. So this is a broad license to discriminate against LGBTQ people, pregnant people, people from different faith backgrounds, people from different racial backgrounds. This is a huge issue that we're fighting. So I can talk more later in the conversation about what's happening politically around these bills, or where I think these bills will go, or where we think these bills will go. But those are the three big bills that we're facing in North Carolina. And yeah, I'll pass it to the next person to talk more about the impacts and what's happening.
Thank you so much, Artie. I wonder if you would say how you find these relating to some of the other legislation that's already passed in other states. I know something just happened in Kansas a few days ago. There was their version of the sports bill had passed in Texas.
Yes. So to tell you the truth, it's hard to keep up with all of the bills that are passing right now. But I will say they're very similar. These were basically written by the Heritage Foundation and passed around the country and to whoever would pick them up. And that's what happened. So a lot of states have passed similar bills. Arkansas just passed one after the other, and they overrode their governor's veto on these bills. And the governor had actually purported anti-trans misinformation in the past and shared anti-trans language, but even he was like, this is not happening in Arkansas, but they overrode his veto. Yeah, we're seeing it all over the country.
And Artie, did I understand correctly that there are only 10 trans athletes that these bills are allegedly in response to?
The athletic band, yes. The North Carolina High School Association, of course, this does not include college. So the North Carolina High School said, and as far as high school students, they have fewer than 10 students. In the judicial hearing, the sponsor of the bill was asked about that because we had the number at that point, and he said, their super secret committee tells us it's fewer than 10. They won't tell us who those students are. And I was like, it's not super secret. These are children. These are minors. You can't just tell everybody everything about school students. So even the idea that children are no longer afforded their rights of privacy and protection in their schools is something that's scary to me as well, because the sponsor is like fear mongering and saying we don't know who these people are, they're shady. I think they're just children.
Thank you so much, Artie. Okay, so we'll switch now to Krista. And again, Krista, thank you for joining us today. We've gotten to work with you a couple of times before here at Crosspointe. So why don't you tell us what you do and for whom?
Yeah, let me start by saying thank you to Artie, Inequality and C. The work that you're doing is so valuable at this point, and I follow your work, and thank you for doing what you do. And then I appreciate, Steve, that Crosspointe is once again continuing to have relevant conversations about important things that not a lot of churches are having at this point. So I am a psychologist. I'm a certified sex therapist. I'm a WPATH. WPATH stands for the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And you may hear me refer to them. They're sort of the governing organization that tells us as mental health professionals and medical professionals how to help transgender folks. And so I'll be referring to them a number of times, but I am a member of WPATH. And a significant amount of my caseload is gender diverse. And there's, I do want to say a caveat. I am not gender diverse myself. I identify as cisgender. And what that means is my biological sex is, it's congruent with my gender identity, how I feel about my gender. And that is not a put down or an insult to me. That is just simply the way that I experience gender for myself. And so, yeah, I may be using different terminology and I'll go over some of those as well. But the reason I bring that up is because I don't have the transgender experience or a transgender experience. And so what I'm going to be talking about today are experiences that through my training and experiences through the clients that I've seen, but not from my personal experience. And anybody who has a different, unique experience or has questions or concerns about something that I say, I'm open to hearing those and reformulating how I'm thinking about things because I don't have access to other people's perspectives. So I will just say that.
Thank you, Krista, and thank you for that clarity. That's helpful, and I'm glad that you're modeling that for the rest of us as well. So you use some terminology. Why don't we get to some terminology so that we can get a really clear picture of what we're talking about? Could you give us some definitions for those of us that maybe aren't as clear on things like the difference between sex and gender and cisgender and transgender?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I will say that I am not unbiased when it comes to the discussion that we're talking about today. I have strong opinions about all of this stuff. However, as a therapist, I have a capacity to try to understand other people's perspectives and understand where they're coming from. And so one of the things that I think might be going on, and this is if I'm giving people the benefit of the doubt, is that a lot of these bills and a lot of the discrimination that's coming down toward trans folks is from people who don't really understand how complex gender is. And I think that there are some who understand and intentionally are doing things differently, but I think that gender is extremely complex and we have to be aware of that complexity when we're talking about it. And so there's 4 aspects that I think are helpful in this discussion just to kind of illustrate that. And so I already talked a little bit about what it means to be cisgender. And in that explanation, I mentioned biological sex, which is what your body says you are. And that can be shown through what your body parts look like. That can be your hormones. That can be what your body parts inside look like. It can be, you know, what your there's all sorts of different aspects that can kind of tell us what your biological sex is. Then there's gender identity, and that's how I feel. That's how I see myself in my body. And whether or not that aligns with my biological sex sort of indicates whether or not somebody's going to fall under the transgender umbrella or not. And then there's gender expression, which is a completely separate thing. So somebody can identify in one way and then choose to express themselves in a different way. And sometimes all of these things align. For somebody who's cisgender like myself, it all aligns. I'm a woman. I see myself as a woman, gender identity wise, and then I express myself in that way. But for those can be variable for any different people, any number of those three factors. And the other piece that all often gets lumped in is sexuality, which I sort of see as kind of a separate thing. It's really who you're attracted to. And you can break that down further to who you're sexually attracted to versus who you're romantically attracted to. And we won't spend much time talking about that, but that's another separate piece that often gets conflated with gender identity. A couple of other terms that I think are helpful. Many of you are familiar with the idea of the gender binary. Some of you may not be. That's this conflating of gender identity and biological sex. And so men are one way, women are the other way. There's only two options. There's nothing in between. We in our society and many societies around the world are set up on the binary, where we assume there's things for girls, there's things for boys, and there's nothing in between. I think a much healthier approach and more helpful approach is to see gender more on a spectrum, where on the extreme far one end, you have masculinity, and on the other end, you have femininity. And then you have a whole bunch of stuff in between that looks different for different people. And part of my job as a therapist, when people first come in, if they are looking to explore their gender, is to help them figure out where on that spectrum they fall. And then I already talked about cisgender, or being cis, when your gender identity aligns with your body. Transgender is sort of the umbrella term for anybody whose gender identity does not match with their body. You may hear words like transmasculine, transfeminine, transmale, transfemale. There's all sorts of words that people use to describe themselves. And I always encourage you, if you're talking to or about trans folks, that you ask them what words they use, what pronouns they use, get from them what feels affirming for them. Don't assume those things. And I do want to just say, if Artie or Ezra has anything they want to add about that or subtract or anything, I'm happy for your perspectives on some of these things. So, any other words, Steve, you think need defining?
No, I think that's helpful. And I also think, and you can respond to this, what you're saying may seem sort of new for some of us, and but there's a lot of other cultures, ancient cultures, that this is not a novel idea at all. Really, we're the new kids on the block of making this such a firm binary, aren't we?
Absolutely. These things have been happening since the beginning of time. People have had different expressions, different ways of experiencing gender.
Yeah, I only found out just a few years ago that even like the ancient rabbis and studying Midrash and Talmudic resources, there are 6 genders, and that was just a very well understood thing, that there are 6 genders. You know, so they would be interested in some of our insistence that, you know, the Bible says. They'd say, well, hang on. So thank you for that. It makes me want to, from your professional perspective, can you help us understand how some of this misunderstanding affects your clients, and as general as it needs to be, to give us an insight on how there's not knowing things and then, oh, neat, I've discovered some new information, but really sort of a pervasive sense of ignorance, even willful ignorance sometimes. How does this ignorance affect many of your clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have a lot of empathy for the experience of living in a world that's not made for you. And so if you can imagine what every day being reminded how you don't fit in, how you don't belong, how you're not like everybody else. And depending on how reinforced that is throughout the day, I mean, you're not okay the way that you are, and that increases shame, that increases social isolation for folks. We can see an increase in depression, anxiety, other kinds of mental health issues, which I want to be clear, do not stem from the gender incongruence itself. It stems from the social pressures and the not being supported, and the higher degree of negative life stressors that folks who are gender diverse experience because of their gender identity and because of being socially ostracized and marginalized. We know that there's a significantly higher suicide rate for folks. I have the statistics somewhere in all of my notes, but we know that trans boys, over 50%, have attempted suicide at some point in their life. Trans girls, 30%. Non-binary folks, 42%. They experience bullying, harassment as they get older, homelessness, sometimes not even when they're old enough to be on their own. There's just a lot of really negative consequences to this whole social experience of not being supported. And then there's another concept that I'm sure many of you heard of, the internalized transphobia, where then it becomes not even about how other people don't think I'm enough or don't think I'm the right way, but I now feel that way about myself. And I turn that toward myself, that hatred, and that becomes a significant issue that I deal with a lot with my clients.
And so, to get particular, I'm curious what you think of what you think the implications are of a teacher, a state employee, it being incumbent upon them to out a child to their parents, to their guardians, whether they're ready for that or not. I would love to hear what you think the implications of that are.
Yeah, I'll just say, Steve, I think even if the child is ready to come out, that doesn't make the situation any better, being outed by somebody else. How you experience gender, and this is a big discovery for a lot of people, and there's a long exploration. I know a lot of kids who spent years trying to figure it out themselves before they even mentioned it to their parents. And so loss of control of something that's so personal, I think, is really traumatic for a lot of these adolescents. I think when it comes to, so I really view what I do with my adolescent clients, and I don't see too many children, but my adolescents, is that they're in a space where it's their job to figure this stuff out. It's their job to explore. It's their job to try on different hats. We've all done that. When I was a teenager, I was trying all sorts of weird stuff, trying to freak my parents out and trying to figure out who I was. And I think that gender and sexuality are just part of that. I think kids nowadays are just realizing, hey, wait a minute, there is something here. Maybe there's something I need to learn about myself during this time. And so during this process of exploration, when parents now all of a sudden know and the kid's not ready, that can really corrupt that experience of being able to figure it out for themselves, because now there's other invested parties who have feelings and thoughts about this whole process. And it's one thing when the kid is ready and is willing to open up to their parents about it. It's another thing when they're not prepared for that, and it just makes the process a lot messier. The outcome of that kind of situation also very much depends on the parent's response. I think that if parents can be supportive and loving and hold the child, hold their exploration and facilitate it, and make sure the child knows that they're unconditionally loved and all of those things that we should be doing as parents, then I think that there's a chance for a much better outcome. It's still not a good situation, the forced outing, but it's an opportunity for a better outcome. Could
I have, well, finish that thought, and then I'd love to hear Ezra and Artie respond to this same question as well. It seems important really to get their response too. So it's a violation, you said.
Yeah, and then just a couple other thoughts. It's an extreme violation of the kid's privacy. That's theirs, and it's violating. They often don't have the supports in place yet, and so if they're still trying to figure it out for themselves, they haven't really found support groups or places that they can go that are affirming. Then that can be a challenge, because all of a sudden they may lose their parents as supports as well. And then outing people can increase suicide risk, because it's really traumatic for folks. So,
yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. So Ezra and Artie, I want to put that same question to you, just with the understanding, and I'd like to say it out loud, that you are free to have whatever boundaries you need to have, for being in this space and being so vulnerable. So if at any time there's a question you don't want to ask, you can certainly pass on it. But what do you think the implications are of this proposed mandate where a teacher would out a child?
Yeah, I think there's, as I think about it, all that just comes into my mind is this just flood of just like the risk for an elevation of violence. And it could be violence in any shape or form. And for me, there's this question of, would I ever do something to increase the potential violence for someone else? And I think that's just the fundamental question, whether you have a larger understanding or a very minimal understanding. I think that just the end of the day, the question is, would I ever do something to increase the potential for violence for someone else? And so I think in the instance of this case, much like you were saying, Krista, there's a whole bunch of safety factors that are not necessarily in place for this child. But I think also too, there's just the element of just the internal safety protections as well that are not fully developed as well around, just like you said, Steve, around boundaries. Like, I don't know if at 14, 15, I had the boundaries in place to articulate for myself what was healthy for me at that moment. And so being put in a position where I don't know that, being put in a position where I don't have the sense to be able to say what is healthy for me, what is safety for me, is another way that violence just increases. That's what comes to mind.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, so my background is in social work. I did my master's work specifically on trans youth and harm reduction. I did my professional work before going into advocacy as a social worker with LGBT youth. And when they talk about coming out, this is like one of the biggest things that we see, especially with youth who are first coming for services, as they're talking about, should I come out? When do I come out? And our first thing that we say to them, and it's unfortunate because people want to live authentically as themselves, is we need to think about your safety. We need to do a risk assessment. There are 1.6 million homeless youth in the country every year, and 40% of them are LGBT, despite only 7% of youth total being LGBT. So youth are on the streets because they are, kicked out of their homes. And that does not include the violence, physical, emotional, sexual, that increases for LGBT youth. On the streets, we see survival sex work, we see violence, and just a total destruction of possibility and potential of a child who could have grown up in a supportive environment, or one at least where they had the option of managing their risk and being out of the home before they were outed or before they told their parents. So I think, it's a cultural shift. We definitely need to, start working on parents, and we train teachers, we train guidance counselors to all be ready for this. But this is a very, very real risk, an increase of violence and homelessness, and all of the repercussions that can come from that, overrepresentation in prisons because they're on the streets. I mean, there's just it snowballs. So, yeah.
Thank you both for that. Krista, there are a lot of, you and I talked about this the other day, there are a lot of myths, dangerous myths about trans folks that get recycled over and over. And one is that the trans community and advocates of the trans community, what they want is for a kid to be able to walk into an office or a clinic or something, and on impulse, on that it's just the flavor of the week, that they want to be other than what they are. I want to be a girl now. And then what they'll get is surgery. They just, so that's the myth, is that they can just walk in and do this. Could you please set us straight on this?
Yeah, so that is, okay, good, I'm not on mute. That is absolutely a myth, that is a possibility. So there's two, from a clinical perspective, there are two types of transition. One or both may happen, but there's social transition measures, which are the kinds that are fully reversible. That's I use these pronouns, this is my name, here's how I'm dressing, here's how I'm engaging with people. All of the stuff that we can do socially to kind of change how we're presenting and how we're experiencing gender in the world. Then there's the medical transition aspects, and that would be if you're any sort of puberty suppressing hormones or cross-sex hormones or surgery measures, those kinds of things. And typically from the way that I work with clients and the way that I've been trained is I do the best that I can to encourage social transition measures prior to medical transition measures. So we know that therapy is not required in order to be able to take some medical transition measures. However, a lot of people, I think that therapy can only help to reinforce or help to explore and create a certain level of certainty. It can only help for folks to really be in the space where they can fully explore, understand, sit with it, be stable in their gender identity for a while. That's sort of how most mental health therapists are working, is we work with clients for a while. And then in order to take medical transition steps, most providers require some sort of a letter from a mental health professional that's saying, I worked with this person for this long, or I've assessed this person, and I believe for all of these reasons that this person should be prescribed these hormones or should have surgery. And here are all the reasons why. Here are the things that could potentially get in the way, but here's what the person is doing to address them. All of these kinds of things go in that letter, and that letter is written to support that person taking steps toward medical transition. There are places who do operate under, so surgery and hormones are separate. They're different. You need, I believe, 2 letters from 2 mental health providers in order to be doing bottom surgery, so surgery on any of the genitals below the waist, and then 1 letter to do top surgery. But a lot of providers require a letter for hormones as well. Some don't. There are some informed consent providers where if the child is under the age of 18, under the age of 17, depending, they can go in. They can the doctor can talk to them about all of the risks and benefits, and they can make that decision for themselves. But I'm not sure, I don't think you can do that unless you're an actual adult. I think there was one informed consent provider who was a pediatrician in Chapel Hill, and I'm not sure if she's still practicing, but she worked closely with parents as well. So it wasn't something she was doing on her own. But ultimately, you can't just go and get surgery. There is a lot that goes into preparing for that and making sure that you have the aftercare, making sure that everything's in place to make sure this is the right choice for the person. And, I think, are there some providers who maybe are a little bit more lax or, allow or write letters maybe earlier on in the process? Absolutely. But that's in every area of work that people do. There are people who view their role differently than other people. By and large, WPATH has people wait and explore and helps to ensure crystallized gender identity prior to. Now, we're not talking years, we're talking, a year and a half, depending on the situation, but you also have to weigh the risks of the kid's safety. You have to weigh their level of support from their parents. There's a lot of factors that contribute to this decision as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I should say that question to demythologize that would not be to diminish or invalidate, you have to prove it to the rest of us that that this is who you are. I think I just wanted to give you a chance to shoot down the notion that this is flippant or this isn't incredibly thoughtful and nuanced. So that's where that question comes from.
Yeah, can I just say one more thing? I just want to differentiate the difference between adults and adolescents, kids under the age of 18. Adults, the guidelines are more relaxed than they are for kids who are under the age of 18, because kids are in that place of exploring and figuring things out. I will say also, the other thing I want to mention is that the rates of detransitioning are very low. So this idea that somebody is going to transition and then, 5 years down the road, change their mind, that might they? Yeah, of course. There are some people who do, but it's much lower than people might think that they are. Many people are very happy and feel much better about themselves once they go through the steps of transitioning.
Any other myths that you bump into that you'd like to, now that you have the floor, just go ahead and knock them over?
Knock them over.
Or at least get them wobbling.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that for the most part, trans people are not confused, and they're not trying to trick anyone. I think there's this idea that people are switching genders for some underlying ulterior motive. And actually, I think transgender people are far more authentic than most of the rest of us, as they're living their truth and they're living authentically. And so, let's see. I already mentioned the low frequency of detransitioning. The idea that there's a cookie cutter way that people need to experience gender and need to transition, that's not true. Everybody experiences gender in a unique way. And do some people fall into that old category of, I'm stuck in the wrong body, I was born in the wrong body? Absolutely. Are there a lot of people who don't experience gender in that way? Absolutely. And so getting into the headspace of recognizing that not everybody's situation looks like Caitlyn Jenner. Everybody's situation looks different. The idea my child is too young to know they're transgender. Kids know sometimes very early on, not everybody, but sometimes they have an inkling, and that doesn't necessarily mean I'm transgender and here's all the things I need to do about it. It just means that they have a sense of gender as they're growing up, and they need to be able to explore and express that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that medical transition measures need to happen at any early on in childhood. That's not something that typically happens. So.
Can I add something there? I'm so sorry. Can I add something?
Yeah, no.
Another thing that I would add is puberty blockers. These are something for children to prevent a puberty that would have irreversible changes, but the puberty blockers themselves, which pauses puberty, is reversible. So that's another thing that this bill would take away, is that. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Thank you, Artie. Yeah, that's helpful. Krista, would you take a second then and help any parents of young children or any grandparents of young children? We have grown up in a certain framework about all this, most of us, and could you as I just heard said by a trans woman, could you show us how we can chill out about gender a little bit for young? There was actually more words than that, but that's the gist of it. Chill out about gender as it pertains to younger people, and like how we raise a young person with this knowledge and this sensitivity.
Whoever said that, I love it. The chill out about gender, because that's exactly what needs to happen. I think that everybody just needs to be free to explore and to see gender as one way that we can express ourselves, and we can do that in any way we choose. And it doesn't have to have long-ranging implications, or it may have long-ranging implications, but chill out and just kind of let it be, I think. And then if something needs to happen, it can happen. I think that's when it comes to working with the real little kids, gender creative kids, is just allowing them to express themselves, allowing them to do whatever feels right for them. I have a 7-year-old, and he is all boy, 100% like stereotypical boy, rambunctious, rowdy, and he loves my nail polish. And so we paint his nails, and we don't make a big deal out of it. We just do it because he wants to. We can't do it before bed because he'll get nail polish on his sheets, but it's just chill out about it. It's not a big deal. I would say to parents as well, it can be, parents by and large want the best for their kids, and they don't want to see their kids struggle. And so they hear that their kid is struggling with gender or is identifying as some variant of transgender, gender diverse, and they're scared. By and large, they're scared. And so usually, they don't know what to do with those feelings. And so I always recommend find your own therapist, find someone for your kid to talk to if they feel like that would be helpful and they need that, and find someone for you to talk to, but somebody who is gender affirming and can help you process these feelings. There's always the risk that you could find somebody who engages in conversion therapy or doesn't believe in gender dysphoria, and that can cause more harm than good. But somebody who really understands how gender works and can help hold those feelings. Having self-compassion, parents being able to recognize this is hard and being kind to themselves and taking care of themselves. I think that's always important. Loving and supporting your kid, remembering that your kid is the priority. And, they need your love and support more than anything when they come out and share this kind of stuff. I think another thing that I think I usually try to find a really soft way to say this to some of my parents who are a little bit more trying to obstruct the process, not using chosen names and pronouns, and not allowing them to express gender in the way that feels right for them. Obstructing the process or obstructing exploration will not change their kids' gender identity. What it will do is it will change the quality of the relationship that they have with that kid. It will erode trust, and it may be irreparable down the road. And so I really try to help people understand the implications of what they're doing. They're not going to change the outcome, but they are going to change their relationship with their kid. And the best thing that parents can do is really support that exploration, using the chosen names and pronouns, allowing them to try on different hats, try on different kinds of clothes, experience the world in a new way, because that's the only way that that person is going to be able to feel their gender reflected back to them and know and be able to evaluate what that feels like, be able to check in and know what that feels like. Yeah. And then, get the child and themselves parts of support groups. There's lots of different organizations around that offer that as they're going through this process. So yeah.
Great. Well, that's all super helpful stuff. And I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that we all now have 150 questions to ask of you. And so, yeah, but always leave them wanting more. Works for showbiz. Let's use it now. Let's shift gears. And just a reminder, we're going to do some Q&A very, very soon. So if you do have questions and you want to put them in the chat, those will go to me, and then I will ask our panel. Ezra, I would love to shift to you, my friend. How do you tell your story as over the years you have probably learned to tell your story? So how do you tell your story?
Yeah, thank you. So, as I'm kind of sitting and just taking all of this in and thinking about the different pieces of legislation, I think one of the things that is so abundantly apparent to me in all of this legislation is that it's being written and talked about by people who this is not their lived experience. And so there is this dissonance that is felt when you know that your own personhood, your own ability to be who you are is being dictated on paper by people this is not their lived experience. And so I think for myself, as I learn to tell my story, and as I think about really what makes me me as a Black transgender male, I think for me, it is the ability to tell my story and to tell my narrative as I am me, and whatever that means at that present moment in time. One of the things that the bill talks about is that there's this discordance that's not permanent, or that you'll outgrow things after puberty, or there's this wait and see approach. And I think it's this misguided understanding that it's like a child is saying, I choose red today and I choose blue tomorrow, versus saying there's something intrinsic about me that I know about my personhood, that I am claiming to be true about myself, that you don't have the ability to tell me whether or not this is going to stay today or go away tomorrow. And so, I think, as I've been kind of just taking everything and listening in, I just want to reiterate and just briefly share, as you asked the question, like, how do I tell my story? I think I tell my story from the vantage point of me and what makes me me, and without the ability of anybody else to tell me who or what makes me me today. Yeah.
Mm. Did you probably didn't well, I don't know, maybe I'm projecting, but I'm assuming it wasn't always that way, where you were able to lean into it that way.
Yeah, no, I definitely was not always able to identify that as that. Growing up in a theologically conservative household, and then even working for theologically conservative organizations with this intention of trying to suppress my identity and trying to fit it into a box of what was stereotypically the norm, and having to come to this understanding of myself of what really does it mean for there to be a norm, and what does it mean if I'm trying to live into this at the expense of my happiness, or at the expense of my joy, and what is this really what the norm is supposed to be about? And I had to take some steps back to just realize and reevaluate who I was and what it meant to really love myself and to honor myself, and whatever that meant at the current moment in time. And what that meant for me was giving myself the freedom to actually look back over my life and the different pieces of what made me me, to realize that no, my gender identity and my gender expression is dissonant, and there's a disconnect between that and who I had been for the first 24 or 5 years of my life, and having to recognize in myself that what happiness and joy looked like was pursuing the version of myself of who I am today. And that meant that I lost people along the way. It meant that there were some very difficult conversations had with family and friends. But those conversations have really solidified for myself what it means to be me. And I've learned what actual love and acceptance looks like, and affirmation looks like, because the people who are still on this journey with me are some of the people who've actually done the most work in themselves as well, to have to go to the support groups and ask the questions, or to learn what it means to love me as me now, and not carrying on what it meant to love me as me before. And it's also meant a reckoning in my faith of having to unlearn a lot of toxic theology that had contributed to me wanting to suppress my own identity as well. And really leaning into this claiming of what a liberative theology for me actually looks like. And my spouse and I have conversations all the time of I don't have it all perfect. I don't have it all worked out now. But what I do know is that this journey of faith for me has to be one that comes with a whole acceptance of myself, and not one that is trying to put me into a box or try to put me into what the I don't want to say theological majority, but a lot of the conservative theological majority would say that I'm supposed to be.
Well, you may have just done it, but I wonder for those of us gathered who this speaks to directly, or were the friend or the sibling or the parent or grandparent or so, of someone, and there's the sense that to really embrace this is going to cost you the things of God and the things of faith. It really does seem like I have to choose the truth, or what somebody told me was the truth. And so could you step into that just a little bit more and speak to those of us who need to hear that your faith was deepened and broadened and enhanced by you getting real?
Yeah. So I'll use my mom as an example. My mom is someone who, when I first came out to her as myself, she went through a very intense period of confusion and just trying to figure out how this then fit into her version of faith that she had known for her whole life. She went to one support group that was supposed to be Christian based, and everyone was just crying and talking about how they weren't going to go to their kids' weddings and how they weren't supporting of these children. And she said, that's not what I need. I need a group that is really going to help me to love my child and help me to reconcile what this means for me and my child at this point. And so she actually went to a PFLAG group, and it just so happened that they had a chaplain at the PFLAG group who really sat down and answered a lot of the questions she had around, did I do something wrong? Did I not pray the prayers hard enough? Did I not do this, that, and the third to keep my child on this straight and narrow path of following God? And what she had to come to recognize in herself was that I was on my own journey, and that my journey was actually leading me to a place of freedom. And so there was something then for her that she had to recognize, that maybe her faith wasn't entirely representative of a true liberative gospel, given that the version of faith that she had really held on to before was one that was causing me pain and causing me suffering. And the version of faith that she wanted to see, and one that I was really embracing, was one that was causing me joy and happiness. And so there was this moment that she really had to come to within herself around, what does it mean to take this next step forward of faith, and really seeking community that would help her kind of walk through that and to really be with her in that place. And so I think, the larger question that I continue to just present in front of people is your version of God one that is actually very limiting, and trying to put people into a controlled space that is not actually leading to a place of joy or happiness? Or is your version of God something that is liberative and something that is joy inducing and something that is actually leading to more freedom of a person? And if it's the former, then I really challenge you to ask, is that actually God, or is that just something you've constructed in your head because it makes it easier sometimes to fit people into a box versus understanding the expansiveness of God as well?
Ezra, I don't want to talk. I just want to let that sit for a second. So that's good stuff. You reminded me that Jesus said the truth will set you free to religious folks. So I think that's important. He was challenging boxes for sure. So, and I just really get a sense I'd like to hug your mom. What a
she's a pretty incredible lady. Yeah,
she sounds pretty incredible. Yeah. Ezra, what would be your message to younger people who feel afraid or maybe even alone because they don't feel like it's safe to be who they really are, and not just theoretically safe, like actually growing up in a place that simultaneously says this is the Bible Belt and also we're trying to legislate against your existence. Yeah. Could you speak to them?
Yeah, I mean, my main word of encouragement would be to find community. And I don't like to glorify the pandemic because it has brought so many terrible things. One piece of glimmering hope that the pandemic has really brought us is the ability to have virtual community and to find community with people who are not necessarily in your specific area that can really affirm you and can really love you and really tell you it's okay to be you. And so my encouragement is to find those people, whether they may be actually around you or whether you may have to look a little bit to find that community. Know that there is really community out there to be that support for you in a place where it may not be okay for you right now to come out as your true self. And that's okay. And it I want to say it'll get easier. Sometimes it doesn't get easier right away. It takes a little bit of time for it to actually get easier. But it's worth it to really stick the course and to find your people who will affirm and love you as you are you. Yeah.
Thank you. Artie, can I put you on the spot and ask you the same question? You're muted. Well, that's a sneaky way to get out of answering something. Let's see. I can ask you to unmute.
Yeah, it said host had to unmute me. I was like, oh, okay.
Sorry, I didn't do that on purpose.
Fine. It's okay. Yeah, I think LGBT youth for so long have been finding community on the internet, and I think that's been dangerous in some ways, but also really great. Or LGBT people in general. I live in a very small town in North Carolina called Waynesville. I mean, it's sort of small. It's west of Asheville. And youth here who are LGBT feel very alone. And one thing that we have, even before the pandemic, was Q Chat, which is from Time Out Youth and some other organizations out of Charlotte and nationally that have started doing online chats. But I think finding community is so good. Finding an adult that you trust who you can talk to about some of your experiences, I think that's really good. And I know it's so cheesy, when It Gets Better was like a big national trend, and a bunch of people were making videos like it gets better, and I'm like, okay, you're like a very wealthy white straight celebrity saying it gets better. And
also it's pretty good right now.
Yeah, right. You're right. It's hard to hear from people who may not have had similar experiences. But the truth is it can get better, and there are ways to have a full, authentic life. Of course, we live in some systems of white supremacy and sexism and homophobia. Those are all real, and so many of trans lives are taken way too early. Black trans women on average don't live past 35. So those are things that we have to remember. And a lot of us have been working really hard to build a better world, and to make sure that people have spaces. And that's one thing that I'm very passionate about, is making sure that everybody has a space where they can be their authentic self, whether it is to worship or to find a home for, find a therapist, even find a doctor. Those things are so hard. And so part of my work has been to ensure that everyone has a place to be. And hopefully we're continuing to build those. The adult spaces to be are actually closing. A lot of our gathering spaces, a lot of our places where we can just exist. And I think part of that is the belief that there's LGBT equality. Gay people can get married, and why do we need our own spaces? But the more marginalized you are in the community, whether it's because you're trans or a person of color or an immigrant or a person who's working class or cash poor or disabled, all those folks, when you have layered marginalization, it's harder to find a home. So we want to make sure that people have a space to go. And that's how we know it gets better, because there are people out there working to make it that way.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. Really, really valuable and informative, and makes something that can exist for some of us theoretical. It makes it reminds us that it's very real. We're going to do some questions now, and I want to say, like I said before, that you're chatting the questions to me, and I want to make sure everybody knows that's not to that's not to silence anybody. I wanted to make sure that this was a really safe space for everybody. So I'm just going to be that pipeline for the questions, and we've got some coming in. So if you've got questions that you would like to ask either Krista or Ezra or Artie, go ahead and chat those to me. I've got a couple here. Let me sort through. There are some questions, and then technical, what's happening with the mute button stuff. Let's see. Ezra, let's see. Let's go ahead and keep you unmuted, each of you. I think that you all have been invited to unmute. Ezra, there was a question about that didn't catch the organization that you're with. So while I'm looking through these questions, would you tell us?
Yeah, so I work for a global interfaith organization called United Religions Initiative. It has been around for 20 years, headquartered out of San Francisco. So I'm a remote employee. I live in Charlotte and work out of San Francisco. And their intention is really just to create a better world in local communities all around the world.
Thank you. Artie said puberty blockers are reversible. Do they affect the child's fertility long term? That is an argument the person asking the question has heard.
Krista, do you want to talk about that? Or do you want me to talk about it?
Yeah, you can go ahead and I can add.
Okay, you go. Okay. I think you probably know more than me.
Or I could answer and you could correct. I mean, we've got options.
I think from what we know, you don't want to have kids on puberty blockers, well, adolescents, I should say, on puberty blockers long term. The absence of having the cross-sex hormones in the system can negatively affect bone density. It can lead to some depression. It can lead to other kinds of issues. And so usually 6 months is ideal, a little longer perhaps, the doctor might be willing to stretch it. As far as fertility goes, I believe it shouldn't affect fertility. If anybody has more of a definitive answer, that would be great. But I think the effects, from what I understand, are fully reversible.
There we go. That sounds answered. There was a question that said, could we spend just a second talking about the difference between sexuality and gender? They may have meant sex and gender. Krista, could you just give us a couple of headlines on the understanding those differences again?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Krista, real quick.
Let's stop for just 1 second.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna need to run. I've got to go to another work engagement, but I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. And Steve, feel free to pass along my email if anybody has any additional questions that they would like me to answer. I'm more than happy to answer them. And just wanted to say thank you, and I'll see you all soon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ezra. Krista, you can go ahead.
Yes. So if you're a visual learner like me, you can Google right now gender unicorn, and you can get an adorable little cartoon picture that explains the difference between those things. But essentially, biological sex is what your body says. And so when, if seeing somebody without any clothes on, you can kind of tell there are certain markers that are there that tell you what their biological sex is, and that's what sex is. Gender identity is how the person feels about their biological sex. And so those two things being not being in conflict, so to speak, or not congruent, can lead to gender dysphoria for folks. Gender is sort of so I'm not quite sure the specific words. So sexuality, I guess. Sexuality would be who you're attracted to. And if we're talking about just gender in general, that would be sort of how you are taking up space in the world. That's how you identify. So, man or woman would be gendered terms. Does that sound about right, Artie? Is there anything else you would add to that?
Such a habit. I always beat myself after I'm done talking, so it's a habit. Yeah, I think that's right. Sexuality is who you're attracted to, gender is who you identify as, and sex is what you were assigned at birth. Yeah. And I shared with Steve the link to the gender unicorn, which it looks a little complicated, but it actually has an interactive one where you can drag along the spectrums of gender identity, sexual orientation and stuff, and really see where you might be on those spectrums.
Okay, and I'm putting that in the chat there. Okay, thank you. Another question. This comes in, this is the last question we just got, but it sums up a couple of the questions that we've gotten. It can feel like these discrimination bills, as they're introduced, especially living in southern states, that they're unstoppable. So what are actionable ways that we can work against the passage of these bills?
Yeah, I feel that. Like, it really feels like a wave of just bad, just like crashing at us all the time right now. But, and I think our capacity as empathetic people right now is being just drained through the pandemic, through murders of people on our street, just like mass murder, like everything is just happening all the time. And then these bills, it's just harmful and it feels really bad. So I want to say that I relate to that feeling. And this is my full-time job. And so I get it. We do have some strategies that we're working on. One of them is just using these to educate our community and to say, like, this is what's still happening. LGBTQ equality is not won and over. We are working really hard. We have a website called ncisready.org. It started as a website to pass local non-discrimination ordinances when the parts of House Bill 2 that made cities not able to do that expired in December. So we created ncisready.org to pass non-discrimination ordinances through towns. And since then, it's also become a place where we're fighting these anti-LGBT bills. And I think it just really shows how much we need local, state, and federal protections on all levels. So we're using these bills as a reason. We also know, and also on this website, you can write your local government, you can write your state reps, you can write your senators in support of the Equality Act. So there's tons of information, tons of stuff on that website. That's ncisready.org. We also know, and I'm not sharing, we don't share this super publicly, so, but I'm going to share it with you. We know that the Republican leadership, and we're nonpartisan, but this is coming from that party, does not want this to pass. The Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader do not want this to pass. They didn't want it to go to committee. This is kind of happening from a very fringe part of the party, except for the athletic bill. It's got about half of the people signed on, or it's got a really big number of people signed on as co-sponsors. Thankfully, like in North Carolina, we don't think this will be signed by the governor. We don't think a veto would be overridden, though we do think that there would be a bipartisan vote to override the governor. This is something that we work really hard with at Equality North Carolina. We do briefings with elected officials, trainings, cultural competency. What are these bills? We've been telling them for months that these bills were going to come up, that we've seen them state by state popping up, and that hopefully it wouldn't happen in North Carolina. Hopefully people remember the history of losing all those jobs and everybody boycotting. But apparently, doing this is more important. Thankfully, we've got some really powerful organizations like the NCAA and some other ones coming out and saying this is not going to happen. I think the NCAA is probably going to scare the General Assembly the most, but we'll probably see a lot of businesses. There are people who still won't come to North Carolina because of House Bill 2, even though it's mostly been repealed or expired. So yeah, I think the biggest thing you can do is reach out to your people, to your representatives, talk to your friends, make sure people know what's going on, and just stay engaged in the conversation and stay aware of what's happening.
Great. All right, so we've got a little bit of time left, so keep the questions coming. This was a great statement on its own that Carl said, with a question at the end. He said, legislative efforts like this and many others that seek to exclude and demonize the other appear to be mostly driven by those who claim to be Christian. This is incredibly misrepresentative of Jesus's message of love and incredibly damaging to how non-Christians view people of faith. What's the best way to reverse this, not just through local efforts, but nationally? And so you all can, Krista and Artie, you can respond to that last part after he sets that up. But I will say, it's a little overwhelming for many of us to think about doing things nationally. And I'm willing to be corrected on this, but sometimes that kind of idea of, I'm going to go out there and change the world is such a noble and then ultimately defeating notion that you end up a little stuck doing nothing but feeling angry. So to change a phrase, act locally and think globally, maybe act locally and think nationally. There are a lot of, things are changing for a lot of people who claim Jesus's name. And then for people that they're not doing that at all, but they're still trying to make sure that America is has as much equality as it can. So anyway, don't overwhelm yourself with thinking nationally as much as knowing that you're linking arms nationally to do what we can locally. And that's the big difference for a lot of us, is just doing things locally. Don't be fooled, and I'm not accusing anybody on this call of being fooled, but don't be fooled of thinking that feeling strongly or being frustrated is activism, because it's the very first part, but it is not. It's not the thing. So, Artie, I don't know, or Krista, if you'd like to respond to that last part of that, the reversal, local, national.
I mean, I can just.
Artie would love to share, but he's muted again. Artie, you have my permission to lay off the mute button.
I just such a habit. I can address the activism part and the Christian part, and then Krista, I know you have something you wanted to say too, but I will say at the national level, there are options, and we're trying to lay things out very systemically, because I know that I get overwhelmed by options. Our conversations with Senator Tillis and Senator Burr have been very productive. I take clergy, I take people of faith, I take trans youth and their parents to have these conversations with their offices. And right now, Senator Burr is a maybe on the Equality Act. Senator Tillis is a no on the Equality Act, but he wants to see something with some more religious protections. And then that brings me to the religious conversation. So none of these bills that ban discrimination are discriminatory against people of faith. It is not a primary orthodoxy of any faith tradition. It is not a required sacred act to discriminate against people. If that is part of the main tenets of your religion, I mean, rethink it. I grew up Southern Baptist, and it's part of the Baptist faith and message is discriminatory, but I don't think they would even say this is one of our tenets of faith. This is a sacred practice that we must continue, right? So we have religious freedom of the Religious Freedoms Protection Act, RFRA, in America, and it was to protect people of minority faiths who were, for instance, maybe people used peyote in a sacred practice. Things like that. So now it's being co-opted to, it was written in by a Democrat too, and now it's being co-opted to protect the right to discriminate as a religious practice. And I talk to my friends in this movement a lot, in the Faith for Equality movement, and a lot of us are just so frustrated because we are people of faith, and we see our faiths being used in this way, and we're not faithful but gay, and gay but also faithful. Like being a Christian is very much entwined with my identity. Like all of this is together. It makes me who I am. So, and part of my faith is to do justice, to love mercy, to love my neighbor, to like all of those things are the tenets of my faith. And I feel like, you know, I have to do things that don't always line up with my faith as a member of the United States. Like my taxes don't always go to the best things, and to the best things that represent my faith. So why does that one sect, which is increasingly a minority, over 70% of Christians in the United States believe in LGBTQ equality. I know from my, like, I just know that this is extremism. It's extremism, and it's politicians using extremist faith that I don't think they even agree with in order to uphold a political power. So the religion argument, while I do empathize with the fact that some people do believe that this is infringent upon their religion, I think that is a learning opportunity rather than a truth of what these like what LGBT protections are. So I just wanted to say that. Krista.
Yeah, thank you. And
Sure.
and it's since it's tied to that, I believe it's Kai said, just to let people know why this is so important to discuss. Of the 10 people who spoke in favor of HB 358 on Wednesday, 4 of them explicitly cited their faith as why they're in favor, and 2 more were representatives of quote unquote Christian organizations. Such a great point, and such a, not to be argumentative, but such a great reassurance that there are people who are like, well, why are you putting politics in your religion? Or why does this church or that church talk about politics? And there's a lot of really solid answers for that. One really solid one is there are a lot of people who wave the Christian flag from a position of power over other people's lives. And why did they just get to do it? You know? And so yeah, such a great point, Kai. Thank you for sharing that. And Krista, you didn't get a chance to respond, and I'd love to hear from you in terms of this overwhelming but necessary local versus national. How do we reverse these things? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think just the only thing that I would say right now to follow up on what you just said, and who decided that somebody's humanity and how they want to live in the world became a political issue anyway? So, you know, as a church bringing this in, talking about politics, this shouldn't be political. This is a human issue. So that's all I would say to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Love it. Love it. Okay, well, we're going to wrap this up. I am so grateful for the time that you gave this, Krista. You've been such a blessing over these last couple of years to many of us for in a lot of ways, and so thank you for the work that you do. It's so important. Yeah, it's a pleasure to get to work with you. Artie, so glad to meet you. I think you and I talked for the first time ever yesterday, and so now look at us, all these minutes later, best of friends. So, and I'm sure you're saying something nice, but you have muted yourself again. So I'm gonna leave you in that purgatory. You deserve it. No, I'm not going to do that. Let me unmute you. I think I speak for everybody. Super grateful for the work that you're doing and how thankless it must seem, because this isn't something that we know you don't clock out.
No.
And so thank you so much. And just on behalf of this entire community, God bless you.
Thank you.
And grace and peace to you on this all important work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Y'all are just fantastic and wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Great. Everybody, this session has been recorded. We'll make it available, I'll just say soon, because that's both vague and true. And there's also going to be some resources on our website. I want to say that it's that some of the, you said NC is ready. Yeah, NCisready.org. And then there's a couple other resources and even some things. There's a film that you can watch, some books. I know a lot of you want to keep this going. So if you go to crosspointe.org/advocacy, you should see that there now or soon to make sure that we all have next steps to take. So thank you everybody for being here. It means a lot to be with you today. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, thank you so much.